Hi, people.
I made a boo-boo.
It made a big boo boo.
Yes. So essentially, long story short, I didn't send John the file for the Christmas episode, so it's not a Christmas episode anymore. It's now a post-Christmas, pre-New Year's episode, basically. So everything you hear is what we recorded before Christmas, but it's now out after Christmas, and we're recording the episode for after New Year's because obviously I'm going blind. So yeah.
You've been hanging out with me for too long.
Here we go. Here we go. He's got the evil fingers going.
It's the end of the year.
Well, almost the end of the year. Like 1 week closer for you, because for us, we record a week early. But yeah, it is very close to the end of the year.
So we thought, for fun, we'd review the past year of, well, year and a bit, just in case we go back. It'd be kind of fascinating to look at some of our old ones. Very fascinating to look back on our really old ones. Over the Notion Nerds, and the episode titles, and just talking about reflections we've gained from them since, what's changed for us. And then a little look to the future for both of us, like what we're planning to do next year and all that lovely stuff. Unfortunately for our word friends, this is going to be one heck of an episode, so we probably aren't going to do a reflection for this, the meaning behind words today, because
yeah, now we'll be talking way too much to actually fit in a words thing, and I think if we were to put a meaning of the words at the end of this, we'd be so like brain fogged that I don't think it would be that interesting. Well, it might be interesting just to listen to us blabber on about something that like our brains have gone nope. And actually I experienced that yesterday. Normally when I'm like relaxing, I'll play chess, and yesterday I did some heavy mental work during the day, so I did a longer relaxation, played chess, and towards the end of it I just forgot where pieces moved, and I was like, yeah, my brain's gone, my brain died. Yeah, I tried to castle with my queen instead of the king, which obviously you can't do in chess, and I was like, I'm so confused right now. So yeah, I felt like my brain would be that at the end of this episode. So
yeah, absolutely. And I've got a whole day, so let's try not to empty my brain.
you do sound like you have a cold, or is that just because it's early in the morning?
It's just because it's early in the morning, and I think I'm recovering from one.
You do have children, so
yeah.
So I don't have to worry about that. My parents don't really. Actually, my parents leave the house more than I do now, to be honest, because I have to go to work every day. My work is in my room, so right. Let's get this first episode done. So I think the first episode for me, so just for reference while we go through this, when I'm doing an episode, so kind of like a behind the scenes a little bit, when I'm doing the episode on the production side, I've got the recording on Zoom, and then once I've got the recording on Zoom, I will put it into a video editor, chop off the start if we do blabber or whatever at the beginning, and then chop off anything needed throughout it. Yeah, John. Most of the time I don't really do that much chopping in the middle because it's just a perfect conversation, because we are just perfect people. But
no,
once
we're not perfect people. We are
professional
podcasters. Yes,
we're PPs. And once I've done that, I will then upload that to YouTube. But when I'm uploading it to YouTube, I will do a speed watch. So I'll watch it through at ×2 speed. Well, I say I'll listen to it at ×2 speed whilst I'm doing some of the notes and bits and bobs elsewhere. And when I'm doing that, when I'm listening to it ×2, most of the time it's like a half-hour conversation, because like we talk for about an hour, ×2 speed, half an hour. And I would take some reflections, because a lot of the time when you've had a conversation, you're having a conversation, you forget what you've spoken about. So I take a couple of reflection points in my Obsidian, of course, and then I will explore those further and later on. And a lot of the time, those reflection points actually appear in my personal blog, because they come up as points in the blog in the week after we've done the recording. So it actually comes out, like my reflection points come out in my blog the week of the podcast episode because we record them a week early, which is actually kind of interesting. So anyone reading my blog will sort of see my reflection insights from the podcast as they come out, but you may not notice. But it means that I have reflection points on all of these episodes. They're just not necessarily directly related to the topic we were talking about at the time. And John's just going to go on a whim.
Yeah, probably bounce off of you a little bit because that's what normally happens.
No, you're independent. You're independent. You're an independent contributor to this conversation.
Oh yes.
I did feel kind of bad when you were like, "Oh, everyone comes to listen to me." I'm like, "No, they don't. No, they don't.
No.
They come to listen to a conversation. If they came to listen to me, they'd be on my podcast."
That's cool later on. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's what it was originally. I think that was back in season 1, wasn't it? When I said that.
No, it was last week.
Was it last week?
Yeah, last week when you said, "Oh, you people are coming to listen to you." I know it was a sarcastic comment, which is why I responded sarcastically. But I was when I was reflecting on that comment, I thought, "No, you need to give yourself more credit."
True. It was interesting because I don't normally watch back the stuff I do, which brought back an interesting conversation for me. So I spoke to you about it, and I'm like, blah, 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 blah. You're like, you need to reflect. And it was interesting because I was sat there for a while going, why? Why do I need to write down a reflection? Because I'm always reflecting, but I'm only reflecting in the moment, which was, I know you can rant like hell about that. And that is something I'm like, I realized was a problem that next year I want to try and resolve, of like only reflecting in the moment and instead reflecting in the moment and after the moment. I think we touched on this on our reflection episode, and I'm like,
do you remember the points that I made?
I think there were like three types of reflection, wasn't it?
Yes.
And I'm like, that was one reflection that I had from the reflection episode when I went back and listened to it, as I was listening to it.
In, on, and after.
Yeah. It was quite interesting because I was like, one of the touch points that I had was, why do I not reflect after? And I think what it was is the act of slowing down, which I think you and I touched on this point one of the pre-episodes, where it's like we were talking about that I've just got lots to do, and you replied with, I don't. And I was like, that's interesting. And it has been like slowly ruminating in the back of my head for quite a while of like, am I trying to move too fast all of the time? Which is yes, because my brain does not shut up and I'm always moving on to the next thing. And so for me, that is something that this has helped me start to do and change.
Can I just challenge you a little bit on that?
Oh, go on then.
So you said your brain doesn't shut up, and I would argue most people's brain doesn't shut up. So can you use that as, it's not necessarily an excuse, but I can't think of a better word right now.
Yeah, no, I suppose in some respects, yeah, it is an excuse. I think by meaning that my brain doesn't shut up, I mean it's always moving on to another thing. Not necessarily that it goes quiet, because I don't think anyone's brains go quiet. But it's like it's always moving on to the next thing.
So would you say you choose to move on rather than stick around? Not with everything, just with certain things, certain thoughts.
Possibly. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, something you can reflect on.
Absolutely. When I watch this episode back.
Well, you don't even have to watch it back, just listen to it back. But yeah, I mean, most of the time when we're having this conversation, like I listen to podcasts every day. I listen to at least an hour's worth of podcasts a day because I listen at times 2, sometimes 2.5, because some podcasts are extremely slow in their conversations. So when I'm listening to it back, I don't have to actively listen the whole time. And with our episodes, a lot of it is because I've had the conversation, it's just like cueing, which is what I mentioned in my active recall video. You can use highlighting or note taking or whatever as mental cues to help you remember whatever it was that you were doing. It's not necessarily active recall, retrieval practice, testing effect, blah, blah, blah. It's not that thing. It's just passively noting down what happened and doing a bit of a passive review so that when you do a more deliberate retrieval practice, there are cues there for you to actually use, which is what I do. Is it's very much a passive listen of, oh yeah, I remember that, because sometimes you forget things. Actually, a lot of times you forget things. That's the point of the memory. The point of remembering is to forget stuff, or the point of the brain is to forget stuff. Otherwise, like, we'd be stressed all the time. So talking about reflection, I guess starting off with the 11th of September is when I have the Notion thingy up for. I don't know whether that's when we posted it. I think it is.
No, we posted it on the 27th.
On the 27th? Why is it on the 11th then?
I have no idea.
In Notion. Interesting. Well, the first episode, We're Coming Back.
Oh, you said, sorry, the We're Coming Back one is on the 11th of September. Yeah, sorry, you said reflection.
Yeah. Speaking of reflection, I was going to go into reflecting on.
Me.
No worries. So the first episode, 11th of September. This was an interesting one for me because it was reflecting on what you did, like at the beginning of the year. So for those that are unfamiliar, the first season ended January of this year, so we might go all the way back to then. But I knew that you were busy, and for me, that conversation triggered a lot of, okay, you were doing that thing at this point. What was I doing? Like, what did I do in that time? And I really wanted to have a look at what I really did. Was I doing anything useful? Because I had finished my master's degree. I had no intention of doing a PhD at that point. I was interested, but I had no idea what to do it on. And I was making YouTube videos, and I was like, what did I even do between season 1 and season 2? So I did a bit of reflection on that, which led to so many different things. And I think the way I see that time between season 1 and season 2 is kind of like summer break from school. And I just played. I just had fun. I was literally doing what I wanted, when I wanted, how I wanted to do it. And even though I did that anyway, like during the season, it was more of a, okay, I don't have this podcast responsibility, so I have at least an hour at the weekend to fumble. It was more than an hour. It was like 3 hours because we like talking. But I had this extra 3 hours that I could play with, and I decided, you know what, let's just have fun in those 3 hours. And it was relaxing to see that, and those 3 hours actually contributed to more reflection, which led to a lot of the habit changes that I've now done. So the podcast every day, the going outside and walking every day, all of the other habits, the really small habits, like where I look, when I look, how I look when I'm walking outside, cleaning teeth, timing of cleaning teeth, time blocking. There's so many different habits that all came from me just having those 3 hours to reflect on what I was actually doing. So even though the first episode was literally just saying, hey, we're coming back, I went quite deep.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I was, when we finished, I think we were both in a different spot. And then when we came back, like for me, as I think I said in the episode, so I had a better understanding of what I was doing. Before, with the first season, I was just bullshitting my way around, and a lot of people noticed how I was more quiet and you were more like talking and much more open and all of that. And there was a lot of like reflection during the creation of that series, and then afterwards it's like, okay, so what did I actually want to do? And in between the time, what happened for me was figuring out what I cared about. Like, I was starting to understand what I really wanted to do, whereas before that, during the first season, it was just like, oh yeah, Notion's cool and I love Notion and Notion's everything, and it's just like, but it never was, and I knew it wasn't, but I couldn't quite fit my hand around what I actually cared about. On the first, like during the first season, it's like, you know, you can tell, I think, if you look, because I've got them up here on beside me, of like the differences between what we had here in the first season and what we have now, the change and the shift in just like what we were talking about. A lot of what we spoke about in the first season was Notion only. Even though I think by the end of the year, you were in Obsidian, weren't you?
So I was playing with other tools all the way through that season, and I hadn't
Mm.
really adopted any tool apart from Notion. I was still heavily using Notion most of the time throughout that season, but I think it was the last episode or the penultimate episode of season 1 that I started actually looking into Obsidian, like for a change, for a use change.
Yeah, I think that's what we were discussing. I was like, you betrayed us and all of that stuff. It was interesting how abrupt it ended, though, didn't it? Because it just stopped because like I just couldn't keep up. I had just taken on a massive project, um, which has since stopped. Um, and I just couldn't keep up with all because at that point I was doing a lot of the editing, or not me. Rebecca was doing a lot of the editing of the uploading, and we were spending a lot more time on it than we are now. Like for us to come back, it became a simple thing of like, right, we don't care what we say in the middle, screw it, cut beginning, cut end. It was very like for both of us when we came back, we were very clear on the intention. Like we took it off of the hosting platform that I had and we moved it onto Anchor because it was free. Because for us, this is just us getting together to chat. It wasn't marketing.
I think an interesting point to bring in here is that our first experience was exactly that, a first experience, and there were loads of like bumps and things that we needed to get over, which we could probably do an episode about that, like the bumps and struggles that we had like for the first season. So there were lots of different things like going backwards and forwards because the first time I'd worked with anyone else on a project online. Like I
Mm.
still like for listeners, I have still like we've never met in person. John and I have never met in person. We've only spoken on Zoom.
Yeah.
So it's like it was the first time I'd worked with anyone that I'd never actually met in person. Like I still don't know how tall he is in comparison to me. It's one of those things where I'm like, what? And when I'm when I'm working with other people, most of the time prior it was in person, so I could either see them at whatever it was, like a coaching session or a lecture or whatever, and having or close to full access to that person, I was like, do I send them a message now? Do I not? Like, who do I talk to? Because obviously John was working with Rebecca as well, so I'm like sitting here thinking, do I message Rebecca? Do I message John? Like, how does this work? And there were loads of things like that in the second season we had sort of sorted, like, oh, we won't do this, this was a friction point, this was an irritation, and now it's much cleaner, I think.
Yeah, it's much cleaner and much easier because because Danny through choice has more like autonomy with what he does compared to me, because of course I was a lot more tied down with clients, especially at that time, and still to a certain extent now, although that is something that I'm looking to achieve next year, is more autonomy, which we can touch on in a bit. um I think that's where we had to shift. For me, it was the case of actually coming up and going, right, I can't do these things. If we bring it up, this is what has to happen. And it was being able to do that, because whereas before it was just, yeah, no, I'll sort it out. It was like trying to take on the world, which is something that sums up my year. Like the last year for me was me trying to take on the world and do everything. And I think when we brought this back, one of the things that was really clear for me is like, I don't need to try and do it all,
Mm.
which I think we've reflected, like we've spoken about before.
That's good. I don't know whether you're happy to have this conversation on like the podcast, but I mean, I'm okay with it. I can cut it out afterwards. But the feeling I got when we first did it was you wanted to have like more control over what was going on. That's what it came across to
Yeah.
me, and you were like, I want to do this, but I want to be in control of like these elements, even though you
Yeah.
didn't necessarily have the bandwidth to do that. Because I was
Yes.
open
Yes.
to doing it, but I was
Yes.
like, I don't
Yes.
want to. Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
That was 100% what was happening. So I wanted to be able, because I think then it was actually my first proper experience of like having someone else do it, because I know how to do all of the things that you do,
Mhm.
like in terms of editing and all of that stuff and blah 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 blah. And it was the first real, it was a real struggle for me of just like letting it go. And like, because yes, I wanted to be able to make sure it was right, because I was thinking of using this for marketing. I was thinking a marketing brain, because business owner, like that's what I was thinking. Oh, I'll be able to use this to market myself, but it never really fit.
Mhm.
And so it was that essence of trying to figure out what, like, I wanted to feel like I was contributing to the conversation, which at that time I didn't feel like I was. I didn't feel like I was doing enough in that conversation, talking enough, saying enough, like being here, doing this, doing that. Because often you spoke most of the time during this time. Because I'm more, not necessarily reflective. That is the wrong word to use. But like, I sit quietly and listen and observe.
You're, I would probably say you prefer to respond to a topic that's brought up rather than trigger the conversation to start with.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yes. Yeah. I like to observe and respond, because I find that interesting. Like for
yeah.
me, that is more interesting, of like observing and responding, because it was, especially then, I didn't know what I wanted to say. I didn't know what I wanted to say, and I'm intrigued to hear from you. Have you heard a difference this season from last season?
Oh yeah, definitely. Something that I know I'm very aware of is that when I talk, I can just go off on one, and I can quite happily talk for 3-4 hours by myself. Um, and when I'm coaching, when I'm coaching in sport or when I'm coaching elsewhere, most of the time my element of the conversation is very minimal, because I will ask a question that triggers their thought, and then the athlete or individual will either respond or they'll go and do the thing. And in the podcast conversations, I felt like I was giving you the opportunities to talk, and you would just either you'd give me an answer, but it would be a very simple closed answer, and I would have to then try and like move the conversation on. Even though we were having this conversation, I felt like I was sort of pushing and guiding the conversation the whole time, which led
Yes.
me to just being more of a voice.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that that resonates. Whereas this season, it's been more, because during that period of time, I knew what I wanted to talk about. I knew what I cared about. I know what I care. I know what I care about now. I know what's important to me. Whereas then I didn't. I was still trying to navigate where I wanted to transition, because I've not necessarily slipped into the Notion scene. Yes, I was one of the first consultants. Yes, I was able to do this, but I've never quite fit the mold. And I still don't really fit the mold. I still kind of hover on the outside of that thing, because of the way I think. It's not just Notion is love, Notion is life. I tried to push myself into that box, but even then I was incredibly uncomfortable in it,
Yeah.
which I realized through thinking about the past episodes. I was just pushing it in there, pushing it in there. Always. Yes, I love Notion. Notion's great. Notion's this, Notion's that. I think every Notion user goes through this experience.
Oh
I
yeah.
think it's an experience of like going from, oh my God, Notion's amazing, to, okay, Notion isn't quite that amazing, to, yeah, there's other options that are better.
I mean, this is going to be an amazing segue, but I think this ties in very well with like the next episode, which was overcomplicating productivity tools. And
Oh, look at
Notion,
that!
yeah, exactly. And Notion, it's very easy to overcomplicate. And I think what everyone does, I think, with Notion, when you see Notion for the first time, is wow, this can do so much stuff. This is great at this, that, the other. And you sort of get like this euphoria of, oh, this is going to be the solution to all my problems. And it was for me for 3 years, and it's great. Then my use case changed, and now it's just a pain in the bum when I go on Notion. I'm like, God, this is slow, because my use case for Notion doesn't suit it. And I think that the first season was very much I was still in the, oh yeah, Notion is really good phase until the sort of the end. And I think you're in the same sort of boat.
Yeah, yeah, it was. And actually, this was the announcement of me adding in Obsidian
Mm.
for me, and I'm still using Obsidian. I'm not using it as much as not going to say should because that's wrong, as I want to. I haven't found the right habit yet. So I'm doing a lot of reflection on why I'm not using it. Whether it's just because I'm focusing too much on the busy stuff or whether it's something else. And so I'm in the process of like, okay, so really sitting down and laying it all out in a way that what do I actually want to achieve with this? What do I not? Like, why is this not working for me? Why am I not in it every day? When I go into a research sprint, because the way I function, I don't go I'm not always researching because unfortunately during this time it's not been practical because of client stuff. If I could just be researching all day I would, but I can't. That's practically not possible for me to do. Um, which it was interesting. So when I did a research sprint, I was in Obsidian the whole entire time. Like it was just like, yes, moving this, piecing together, and it gave me like the space to think differently. And my original thought, I think, when I spoke about this, was that I was going to bring it into Notion. Still in Obsidian, I've not brought it into Notion. And in fact, one of the things that I'm thinking of rebuilding my Notion at the moment, I'm working with my team to rebuild my Notion because Notion is no longer suiting anyone's purpose. Like for me, it's become too big, and there's still old stuff in there because I haven't had the time to do proper cleanup and reflection and all that stuff on the Notion space, and it's just been there and being used. I've slotted in a couple of bits and pieces in there, but I think it's turned into a fact of like there's too many things that I need to do in it, and so I want to, and that is the Notion. That is Notion in a nutshell. That is no, there's too many things that I need to tweak and need to move and you need to push around and I need to do this and I need to do that. But at the same time, I still have not found another app that can work with a team in a way that is customizable, which is the sacrifice that you have to make. And so as one of the things that I say to clients and all the time is reduce the friction down as low as physically possible, because if you can, and that's what I'm doing now. It's like, okay, so what ticks off my team about Notion, about this space, about this system? And often it's the little things, which some of it's already been fixed. For example, thank you, Notion, for finally allowing us freaking click some of the roll-ups. Not all of them,
Yes.
but some of them. Thank you. Because that is because my system is very much roll-up based. Client, CRM, email. Oh my gosh, it was a pain in the backside. But now that's been brought in, that's something that made me really happy. And I think kind of overcomplicating productivity tools, kind of coming back onto there, it's like we try to create the end scenario, but we forget we grow and change. And over the year, I have changed even further. The direction of my business has changed. It's moved from me and one other person to me and three people to me and then one other person again to move. There's so many changes that have been made, and the system has just stayed the same. Even though there's a lot of changes and there are things missing, there are things that are lacking in the system. I couldn't put my finger on one thing, which is why there needs to be reflection and why I'm bringing other people who are on my team into this. I mean, two of them are Notion people anyway, so bringing them in to go, okay, what can I improve here? What's missing? What do you think that I am missing? And it was interesting, and that's something that I'm kind of still reflecting on. And Obsidian is still mainly my space. Well, no, it is my space because I can't publish it anywhere and don't want to. But reflecting on Obsidian and like what I want it to achieve in the next year, what I want to do. And of course, it's like going on to like the how's this for a segue? Obsidian is where I do my note taking, which leads us on to
the next episode. Before we move there, though, I do want to link or say something a little bit about the overcomplicating productivity tools with what I've done. So I did a reflection piece on that sort of episode, and there were lots of different questions I had about the tools I was using, yes, but the tools I choose not to use as well. Like, why am I not using that thing? And it really opened up why I'm not exploring a lot of tools anymore. And the reason is most tools only do one niche thing really, really well. And most of my use cases require more than one niche thing. And partly thanks to my YouTube channel, but I get messages from loads of developers and creators of different apps and tools and software. And it's great that they're sharing their stuff. But if it doesn't challenge something that I'm currently using, I don't care. Sorry, I don't care. It may sound harsh, but if it's not going to challenge whatever it is that I'm using, if I'm not going to include it in my workflow, then why would I spend the time exploring the tool? That is the approach that I took after that episode. When reflecting, I was like, why am I not looking at these tools, or why don't I want to look at these tools? And the reason is, if I'm not going to use it, if I have no intention of using it for a use case or for a friction point that I have, then I'm not going to use it. So I've been sat with Todoist, Morgan, and Obsidian for my planning, organizing, note taking for almost a year now.
Yeah.
There have been other tools that have come in, but other niche tools for specific use cases, i.e. Research Rabbit for researching, and then Zotero for collecting all of those papers, because having a folder full of papers is great, but when you've got like thousands, you need to be able to search for them easily.
Yeah, I think kind of riffing off of that a little bit, I think it's what my thing that I want to be doing is reflecting on what tools I'm not using as well. It's actually a really good point of like, what tool? Why do I not use it? Why
Roam
do I
was a
not
big
want to
one.
use it?
Why don't I use Roam? Too expensive. It's literally it.
Why don't you? I never got on with Rome. I know Obsidian is sort of similar, but I feel that there is. I'd love to talk. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. I explored Rome and I explored Obsidian, and I still prefer Obsidian. Just end of.
I mean,
You've
this.
done a deep dive into both, haven't you?
Yeah, I think this is one of the irritations I had with a couple of the comparisons that I've seen online recently with Obsidian and Rome, and they're put into the same bucket, which I understand from an outsider's perspective. You can dump them in the same bucket, same with Hypernotes, but they're not the same application. They are different applications, and it irritates me that people say Obsidian and Rome are like interchangeable, because Obsidian, you can have multiple panels. Rome, there's two. It's two. That's it. Rome, you have more query-based functions that are more, I'd say useful. It depends on your use case, but they are more exploratory. You can query things, you can interact with them, you can go in and out of all of the different tags, aliases, whatever you want to call them, and there is more freedom in database use inside of Rome. But that does mean that you don't have the same flexibility with all of the other things you have with Obsidian, like all of the community plugins, plus all of the hotkeys and the shortcuts and the local storage advantages, and the speed. Speed being one of those. Yes, it's one word, but it's a big factor when you're using a tool. And I think because of the way Obsidian is with the pages, it just drastically changes the use of the app, how you go in and out of pages. Yes, people can argue what you see, what you get editor. Obsidian has that in the insider program now, and the middle click is amazing. Came out yesterday. But
Yeah, I've been playing with that. It's pretty cool.
But the advantages of Rome over Obsidian is literally just the query-based features. Do I want to pay £15 or $15 whatever it is a month for a query feature? No, because I can just type in the filter or go into search.
Yeah, and I think that's it. It's like what's important to you and what do you want, which is kind of what we spoke about in overcomplicating productivity tools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then moving into note taking, which you very nicely segued to. My note taking it's the same, but it's not. We were going to talk about it a little bit in the last episode, but time sort of ran out. So my note taking is still the same in that I have capture, processing, and working notes, but the structure of those notes changed quite recently. And this episode got me thinking a lot about what I note take, why I note take, and my system. And the whole note taking spiel on my Obsidian publish actually came from this episode. So if you are curious about all my thoughts, hey, Obsidian publish. Some of those notes have changed in structure though, because what I realized when I was exploring Scrivener, which is another tool that I was looking at for a specific use case, didn't quite work for me. But what I saw in Scrivener, where there were a couple of features that I thought, oh, this makes life easier. One of them being a synopsis of the note, just here's what this note is talking about. Because what I found in my processing notes was here is loads and loads and loads of points, which are great. I love the notes. But I know what they mean. Other people looking at them, not necessarily. And when I go to the working note is so condensed that I was like, great. And I ended up clicking lots of different places, which is it's exactly what I wanted to do. But essentially what the note was it was a synopsis in one block, and then it was the links. And they were the two main points. And then I had my to-do work at the bottom. And I changed that up so that I had the synopsis at the top, the links as a list, because that way I didn't have to try and put the links in the synopsis. And that's the difference. I sort of separated those things so the synopsis could be shorter and cleaner, and the links could just be a list and go, okay, that's the page, that's the page, that's the page. And then the points can then be expanded in that page, rather than me having to go all over the place and find different points. I say all over the place, click through all the links and scroll down the page previews, which I still do through the links panel. But I have the points, and it means I can put more references with those points, because what I was finding was I had like 6 or 7 references for one point, but then you'd have 6 or 7 footnote numbers in this paragraph line. You're like, what? That just looks like a mess now. So I have the points. So I've got the synopsis, I've got the links, and I got the points, and then I have my to-do. So I've changed the section up. It's still got the same information in the note, but it's presented in a different way to suit what I want.
It's more structured. It's kind of a little bit. It's got a little bit more structure. Yeah, that's something that I'm exploring. It's like, what do I want to do with my notes? Because I'm noticing a friction between processing and working. I'm noticing just like a friction point of like understanding what my understanding of the difference is. I think that's where my brain is, especially with Obsidian at the moment. It's like, what do I want to do? And I actually built a Notion template for a client of mine. And I'm like, can I bring that into Obsidian? The answer is, of course, fucking yes. Because a lot of what I'm doing, so for the next year, I will be doing a shit ton more research because I'm writing a book. And that's what I'm doing next year, is writing a book. Because, I mean, I've been planning it for like 6 months to a year now. Like I've been playing around with it for a while, of like, that is something that we're gonna do. And now, after the last year of reflection and understanding of what I care about and really finding what I care about, I'm gonna write a book. And so for me, my head is like, okay, so now I'm not just note taking for the sake of note taking. I'm not note taking just to learn. I'm note taking to not just learn, but also reflect and turn it into part of the book, like notes on my ideas on each of the things. Some of the things we've been talking about, and something that I will be doing is going back over all of these. I've actually imported them into Descript because I like to read and listen. I feel like it's very tactile for me, and I enjoy that feeling, and so I do that every time. To reflect and just listen to what we've been saying and go, obviously 2 times speed, because we talk way too slow. For people on the audio, that was sarcasm.
What is that? If you don't understand what sarcasm is, you certainly wouldn't be listening to this.
No, definitely not. So yeah, like, my note taking is shifting to being more structured, and I like making. Originally, I put my content into Obsidian. I don't think I'm actually going to keep it in Obsidian. I think the figuring out what I want to do is in Obsidian, and I'm now looking for an app that is focused on just writing. I think one of the previous episodes you did was like you were trying to find something for like your researching and the paper you want to write and what you were using. I hate Word, and I wish it could die. I don't like Google Docs. It's functionally fine, but I want something that is 1, offline, and 2, always works and doesn't die every time. I want something that I can just use. So I'm exploring Ulysses.
You want an invisible app.
Yes, I do. Oh, yay.
Segway.
Segway.
Uh,
Here you go now.
sorry. Yeah, so invisible app. When it comes to the writing tools, Word, I don't like Word. I'm writing, so we'll talk about this later on in the episode. But next year, I'm going to be writing a research review, I am writing a research review, which is in Word because I can export it to a PDF quite easily. Now I could do that in Scrivener, but because partly because I'm more familiar with Word, and because I did a review on Word, Obsidian, and Scrivener, and as much as I hate to say it, Word does everything that I need it to do, and it's actually better in a lot of ways. It's just nasty. There's no objective reason to not like Word, but it just looks nasty and it just functions odd. I just
For
don't
me,
like it.
it was too slow.
Maybe, yeah.
For me, it was just like, I mean, we've been doing some stuff on Word recently, and I don't know whether we need to cut this bit out, but if I ever have to use Word after this book is finished, I'm gonna cry. Just
We're going to keep it in because if you do use Word, I will laugh.
yeah, no, that's fair shout. That's fair enough. I'm exploring Ulysses because I like Markdown. Like I am using Markdown everywhere now. Thank you, ConvertKit, for adding some basic Markdown into ConvertKit, basically headers. Like I use Markdown everywhere, and I like to use that because it's right. So Ulysses is one I'm looking at. I haven't dived at all into it. I just signed up this past like week for it. I joined Setapps because there are too many good applications that I want and would rather just have them all. That's what we were talking about before. Um, your face is just, oh god, he's got another app again. Here he goes again. But I think this actually does touch on the invisible app concept of like what is an invisible app. I think that's something we were talking about, and like going on to what I'm looking for in the new year, like this was something that I'm thinking about. It's like, how can I just reduce every single friction point I have with as many things as possible? It is unfortunately hard, if not impossible, to get a frictionless system. There always is going to have to be some form of friction that gets there, and just which is, I think, if I remember rightly, is a complete 180 on my original thoughts on it.
Mm.
Because
Yes.
originally I said everything has to be frictionless, but it's not possible.
So during my reflection of this, which is why I was smiling when you were saying that, during my reflection of this, I was thinking about apps as tools, which they are. And when I was thinking about the body, because sports coaching, anatomy, physiology, the rest of it, I was thinking, okay, how does our body function? How does our body work with tools and apps and tech, etc.? And most of the time, our body needs friction. It needs a negative. It needs something bad for there to be good. When you think about pain and pleasure, it's a conflicting experiences of both good and bad to give a baseline level. If you sat at baseline, you will slowly decrease. Because it's the way the body works, your perception of it will become sort of null and void essentially, and then all the other different interactions up and down, like addictions and the rest of it. So I was thinking about that with tools and apps, and I was thinking, you know what? I think there needs to be an element of friction sometimes in the tool you're using, so you can appreciate why it's useful when it is useful. That was one of the reflections I had. Like if you don't have friction, if you don't experience friction points in other tools or in the tool you're using, then you can't appreciate it as much for the things that it does well. And that's something I think. Like this was my reflection. I think I was struggling with Notion because there wasn't any obvious friction points when I was using Notion, but when I used another app, I was like, wow, there is this big friction point now. So I needed to do a bit of outside exploration to see the friction points elsewhere to sort of confirm what it is that I was using. But also I needed to have a look at the app and go, actually, is this app any good for this thing? And if it wasn't, just accept that it wasn't and go, okay, let's use something else, which is eventually why I moved away from Notion.
Yeah, and I think there's a kind of point of context which needs to be approached here, because I was thinking about this myself yesterday and reflecting on something we were talking about in a session I was attending, was around sometimes you need frictionless. Sometimes, if there are things that are just something you hate and you cannot, but it is a requirement for you to do your job effectively and doing it correctly, I think it's less around friction, like, oh, just see what the friction points are and blah 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 blah. I think in general your point stands really well, but just to bring some more context, because as we say all the time, context is key. If you have a task that is already you have a lot of friction with, as in just a personal, like, I hate putting money in and sorting out my money and doing all the money stuff for the business, but I need to know what's going on. It is a sad, frustrating part of what I do. I have to be able to keep track of the money. I have to know how much is coming in, how much is going out, where I'm going, how I'm moving forward, what I need to do. It helps to direct my business in a way that is profitable, because before I just made it up as I went along, and it shows. It shows. Whereas in this year, I made a very huge effort of like directly controlling and knowing what's happening with my money. But to do that, I needed to have as few friction points as possible in the software, in the tool that I was using. And I needed to create a system that made it stupid simple. Like, it was like, come in every single day, put this bit in here, put this bit in here, put this bit in there. Right, I'm off. Bye. Because I hated it. I absolutely hated it. And so I started off with a frictionless system, and then as I developed over time and I grew familiar with what the benefits, I saw the benefits, I got that wonderful dopamine hit when I could go, oh wow, I've hit this amount of money a month, and oh wow, I can achieve this if I just do this. Then I started shifting my needs, and so the need for frictionless changed to, let's add a little bit of friction because it means that I have what I want, which is what I've done. I've redesigned my simple money sheet to be less about just a list and more like separating out into the income and the expenses. But I started from frictionless, because at that point, well, friction less, not frictionless, friction dash less.
So the way I perceive that story is you had friction, you reduced friction, then you reintroduced friction.
Yeah, pretty much. And the reason why
which
is because
that
it's very much there is I wouldn't call it friction, but the frictionless design of it caused friction.
yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it meant I had to change what I was doing. What was originally a frictionless experience wasn't anymore, because I couldn't see what I wanted to see because my needs changed, going back to like,
Yeah, I would say the words I'm going to use come from the S&C world, so they may not translate directly, but frequency, intensity, and direction of the friction. So how intense the friction was, whether that was really big or really low, the frequency, so how often you had to deal with the thing, and then direction, so what the actual friction point was. I think all of those elements of friction changed for you through that sort of like up and down, which is where like my thinking process behind it is the friction, the interaction between pain and pleasure, friction and frictionless, can create what we need when we need it. I think, because as you say, like, context matters. As time moves forwards, the friction point may actually increase or decrease depending on what it is that you're doing. Even though you haven't done anything to the system, time has created that friction point or reduced that friction point.
yeah.
Agreed. Nice.
Agreed. It's right. Yeah, it's just right. It says, yep.
So moving on with a segue with the team, client, and personal management. I assume the friction points that you had with your team were they. My assumption would be, as like you experience more friction, they experience more friction, but I don't know.
I think
because I remember this episode being very much a you conversation, because obviously I wasn't a team and I'm still not a team. I think the closest thing to team that I manage is like this conversation right here. That was sorted.
Yeah, I think one of the conversations was that we did use Obsidian and Notion in this example because Obsidian is perfect and Notion is not. Sorry, other way around. Obsidian is Notion is. Let's just clip that bit and then really tick off everybody. Notion's not for team management. Obsidian is.
You can't share anything. You can't do anything. You can't communicate at all. Basically, what you do is fire your team. Just fire them. Get rid of them. Don't need them. Just tell them to work on their own.
I think there's a lot around team management that is non-app related that I think I didn't really talk about in that session, of around how you can't just set up an app and let people go, which is obvious, but it's a point of like, the app isn't a replacement for you leading your team. And I think sometimes it's easy to get caught into that. This is the app, this is how we manage things, and this is how it works. And then you forget the humanity behind it and the humans that are there, which is something that I did lose track of this year, something that I really struggled with. Because of when you're doing so many things, which is what I was doing at the time, and still am really in hindsight, of like, when you're trying to do all the things, there are always things that slip. And we rely on our systems to help us, but that becomes a little bit of a honeypot. It's like you're a little bit trapped in that one, which I think is what happened to me during this year. Of just like, here's an app, this is how it works, just get on with it. Which is wrong. And maybe I am just being a little bit harsh on myself, or maybe I'm not. There's always a moment of reflection to figure out what was what there. But I think like my only thoughts on like team, client, and personal management has been, I still believe Notion is a fantastic tool and one of the only tools that can do like create a system that is customized to what a person needs. But I also think there is a now when you have things like the API, which is nowhere near perfect, but it exists, yay. I think there's a point of remembering that not everything has to still be in one place. You can, like, an all-in-one system does not necessarily mean your team will be managed better. And it does not necessarily mean that things will get done.
I think from my perspective, like looking at my reflection on this specific point, was very much a, do I want a team? If I do want a team, do I plan for it now? That was where my reflection point was going, my conversation was going. And to what you've just said there about, just because you've said this is a tool we're using, like, go use it. It's obvious that people take time to develop and learn whatever it is that you've decided to do. And when it comes to the coaching element of your system, of the team, of whatever it is that's going on, it's as a coach, it's very easy to say, well, I've already said it, I've already told you. Yeah, but that doesn't mean they understood it. It doesn't mean they got it. And that's actually part of the PhD that I'm looking to explore with understanding and motivation. I'll explain that a little bit later, but it's interesting how the idea about, okay, I've told you this, but we still need to explore this. And even though I've given you instructions, there are still elements that you need to understand, or we need to try and work through to get to something that is a team rather than just me and you. It's one of those dynamics that I still haven't done really, because it's just us. So that element of conversation is still in my mind going, okay, do I want a team? And if I do want a team, how would I go about doing it? That's one of those questions that I still don't have an answer to, because I'm not in a team. I don't think I will. Personally, I don't want a team at this point in time, but in the future.
That's actually a really good thing to just touch on. It's like, you don't have to have one.
And that was part of my reflection. I was like, do I want or do I need a team? No.
And also, I think there's a a point to make, just something you were touching on, which sparked something for me, was around the understanding and the knowledge that sometimes you can get caught up in things that don't make sense, and it moves past who you want to be and where you want to go in the direction you want to be. I'm being clearly like discreet because it was a conversation that I've had with a member of my team, someone who used to be in my team and is no longer in there. It was around like making it clear the needs and the responsibility, and the fact that when sometimes, depending on who you're working with, there can be a hierarchy, which sucks. Even though we try to avoid putting that in there, there sometimes is, and it's often the blame is put on the one at the bottom. And this has happened to me in the work that I do, and this has happened in my own team. And it's like understanding that one thing that's changed for me from this year, a little bit beyond this, is like the team is incredibly important to just keep talking and keep communication, which is an obvious statement to make. But also, when you get into the hustle and bustle of the work that you're doing, it's also something that can go. It's one of the first things to go, and one of the first things that can become troublesome. And if you find yourself not being able to stand up and lead a team, because that's what you have to do, and that's part of what you have to do. And leading a team doesn't necessarily meaning just go, you go do this, you go do that. It's not a boss, it's a leader. It's trying to stand up and go, hey, I can see you're struggling, what's going on, like what am I missing, and ensuring that the person at the bottom feels as valued as the person at the top, and they're not just being crapped on by everybody else, which is hard because someone takes responsibility and someone takes the blame, and often it's always far more complicated. And let's be honest, personal dynamics is a whole topic that could be discussed forever and is never easy.
What you have basically said is coaching science is difficult.
Yeah, that.
And I think this is partly the reason that I'm actually going to be doing the review, because I'm curious about all of the elements of coaching science. It was my undergraduate degree and a lot of my postgraduate degree, taking out the sports science elements. And what most of us are good at is knowing the fundamentals, but not necessarily applying the fundamentals. And that's not necessarily applying the fundamentals when we know to do it, applying the fundamentals when we have other things on our mind. And that is where the coach, I think, should be playing a role, whether that's a coach or a leader, that's a person in charge, or maybe it's someone separate from the company, from the business, from whoever. Most coaches, this is something that I got from my undergraduate. It was like one of the first things that my head of course in my first year said, and I was like, what? I disagree. And then like second year, I was like, no, I completely agree now. Was coaches should make themselves redundant until they're needed.
Oh, yeah.
And I completely disagreed. I was like, no, a coach needs to do this, that, and the other. They need to tell, they need to instruct. But no, a coach needs to help the individual do it themselves. And then when they do struggle, keep them like somewhat guided in some way, so they stay on track. So the fundamentals, even though they know how to do them, sometimes they need reminding that they need to do them, or that they should do them in this context or that use case or whatever it was. And that's where I think outside influence plays a role. And this is where I don't have a team, but I use outside influence all of the time to help myself out. And as a couple examples, like online, like basically people online that are talking about leadership, talking about coaching, or they have conversations through podcasts about experiences, topics, use cases that I'm currently going through. They just talk on their experience, and I'm like, that's the lesson they took. Can I take that into mine, or whatever it was? So I use their conversations and their reflections as part of my own. Now, not everyone can do that, but that's my current approach.
Yeah, and I think that brings up an interesting. So I recently, I'm gonna butcher the name, so I'm gonna have to look it up. For me, I've been struggling, with I am in a certain particular space, the notion space, but there is far more that I really love thinking about, and that's some of our conversations. But I
Segue. What happens when transitions occur?
oh, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So I experienced the transition. So I am going through a transition right now where I am realizing what I wanted and expected from other people isn't ever going to happen. It can't happen in the way that I need it. So I needed to find a solution that worked. I needed to move from where I was to where I want to be. And for me, one thing that literally recently has been happening, what I've been feeling is I have these conversations with Danny and the conversations outside of, where we go deep into really, I hate the word intellectual, but like it is not stuff everybody talks about, basically, and what people don't talk about. And it's like, yeah, me and Danny have that, me and Esme have that to a certain degree, and it's like, but there's no one else. And I am getting to a point where I'm actually I want to be the dumbest person in the room, which sounds really obnoxious to say that I'm super smart and brainy. But with the people that I hang out with outside of this space, like I am always the one who is giving the advice, providing the support, doing that. It's like the place that I've set myself up. But now I want to move into a place of being the dumbest one, because then I can learn, because then I can, and I felt, sounds so fucking obnoxious, but oh well. Um, I
Honesty.
was I was tired of it. I was tired of always knowing things and always being the one people asked. I wanted to be the one who was quiet in the background, learning and finding new things to discover, and it was more interesting for me. And I noticed that in the final kind of couple of episodes of this season, where I was like, huh, yeah, I already knew you were incredibly learned. Learned? Is that the right word? I don't know what it would fucking.
Educated?
And there you go. You like I am not.
That's
I
what I
do
don't
not
know.
have a PhD. I did not go to university. I'm completely. I self teach myself everything. I'm self directed, self learner, whatever the fucking word is. I don't care anymore. Um, and like it was fun to be in the position where I was just asking questions. And the last couple of episodes that we've had, the last couple of weeks, I was just asking you questions because I had no comments to make. Because I didn't know. And it, for me, it made me go, okay, cool. I want to know now, but I want to know from varying places, not just from one source. Because a lot of what I've done over the past year or so is building a small community of people where I know everyone and there's a good connection between everyone in some respects. And I wanted to move out of that. So segue round, I actually moved myself over and transitioned into a new community which I'd never been in, and I got to be not the smart one and just learn. And there's a concept in music, it's like, when you're in a band situation of like being the crappiest player, because then you gain so much more from being the crappiest player, because you learn and you can develop and you can move yourself forward. And for me, that's something that I'm transitioning to this year, is to become the crappiest player in the band, to become the one who doesn't know. And we're talking about complex subjects. And another reason why I dived into research, because it's like, I ain't got a clue. I'm not academic. I'm not. And I now realize that. Yeah, I'm more academic than many people, but I'm not in academia. I cannot push. I'm waiting
I
for
think I think
academic
that
challenge.
phrasing was better. I think that phrasing was better.
Yeah.
I think everyone can be academic. Academic is a term. I mean, this moves into like to the next episode, meanings behind words. But I kind of want to talk
Hey.
about transitions. I want to talk about transitions very quickly. So everyone is academic and what the traditional meaning of academic is, because we are all smart. It's just in certain contexts which aren't traditionally seen in institutions of academia. So yeah. And when it comes to transitions, I found what you said quite interesting, because my experience is a little bit different. I've always been like so in most sports teams that I've been in, whether that's trampoline, handball, football, I've been like the Google. If they can't be asked to figure something out or work something out, or they don't know something, they just ask me. It's like, ask Danny. It was just
Yeah, I'm the
I don't know,
same.
go ask Danny. I'm like, oh, sod off. But when I went to university, like I think it was second year I was struggling anyway mentally, but second year I was in my cohort. Most of my cohort didn't have the same background of education. I'm going to sound really snobby here, but everyone in my cohort minus like 3 people had BTECs. They had like triple BTEC sport, and I went in with A-level maths, A-level biology, A-level PE, triple BTEC sport, and like 4 leadership courses. So my qualification on paper was far beyond them. And whenever it went into a topic of maths or biology, I was always sat in the lecture going, oh my God, this is so pointless. This is so boring. And it was irritating for me talking to a lot of my peers. And what you were saying about, I want to be the dumbest person in the room, that's what I wanted all the time. So I spent most of my university time in tutorials, speaking with the lecturers, speaking with lead researchers, because my peers, as much as they were great to talk to, sometimes I was like, I don't care. Like I learned this like 3 years ago. Can we move the conversation on, please? Which is partly what I'm actually moving into on the YouTube channel, is like the conversations people are having are just repeated old conversation. Like, great, can we move this forwards now? Let's step forwards. Let's step on. Like I want to challenge what we're thinking. And the transition reflection that I had was, okay, what transitions am I going to make now? Because pushing forwards is great, but where do you stop? Do you stop? Do you keep going? What carries on? And it's part of the reason that I've decided to do a PhD in 2022.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, moving back to that transition that I have made not so seamless. Meanings behind words. It's the section that we're not doing today, but meanings behind words. And I'm going to move back to that transition that was so seamless in academics. Academics, when you look at the etymology of the word, is essentially in institutions. It's just, this is an academic institution. Great. What does that mean? It means a building full of people that are doing essentially one bit of research most of the time. I think it started somewhere in Greece, like philosophy, academia thing, somewhere like that. I don't know. I don't remember. I haven't researched it. But that's from memory of conversations. Feel free to double check that. But the word itself, I was like, oh, okay, which is why the term internet academic was something that I wanted to push, because you can be an academic, you can do academic stuff without an institution, because the internet is a form of institution. That was my argument.
I like that. I love that. That's nice. I like that. Yeah, it is. And I think that's something that what I'd like to see in the future is more of the academic researchers, etc., journals. I don't know the correct term, but bringing more accessibility to more research, because it is hard to get access to research if you do not have a freaking like just to get started. Once you know how, it's great, but there is no easy way of, like, from my understanding, you cannot access journals without paying an awful lot of money, and you can only access one type of journal, and you can only access one type of this and that, but you have to have an institutional email, like, primarily. Am I wrong? If I'm wrong, correct me, but that's by my experience.
Yeah, it's very dependent on the, it's sort of dependent on the country you're in. Essentially, there are journals which are basically like publishers. You've got publishers, you've journals, and then you've got articles. So the journals are like in the book world, the journals are like the publishers. Like this book has been published through whatever, but in academia there are also publishers. So you've got like Elsevier, and I don't know how you say all. They are publishers that have multiple journals in them, and you would need to either subscribe to the journal, which costs a lot of money, which is why university costs a lot of money, because they have to subscribe to all the journals. And you can't access the journal without paying for it, but you can access the articles without paying for it.
And however, the barrier to entry is much higher if you do not have an academic email. And what I'd like to see,
I wouldn't say the barrier is higher, because the academic email basically just gives you the access to university that you are with has. So for example, my Brighton University email account is null and void now because I graduated. I will get the access back. But if the university didn't pay for the journal, I wouldn't have access to the journal just like any other person. So you only have access to the journals the university has paid for, that your into your educational like email lets you have access to, which can be more. But from my experience, my sister's experience right now, like Sci-Hub is a great website, and my sister is at university and she couldn't access some of the papers that her university course asked her to access, so she had to use Sci-Hub. She's at university and had to use Sci-Hub to access a paper that her course wanted her to access. Yeah. And that's not because of the university, that's because the journals were changing prices, changing access and the rest of it. And it just got confused. So even for academics, it's difficult to access the papers.
Then I rephrase my previous, just want it easier to access academic research that does not necessarily involving emailing the academics, because I'm sure they're very busy, like emailing the people who are writing it. Like I want to be it, like if we can make it possible for, even if we have to pay, maybe not quite as much, but like just to be able to access things easier, the you know, the sharing of knowledge and the research that is being given, it's so hard to access unless you know how. Once you know how, it's easy. And I think tools like Research Rabbit are helping to a certain degree. Like I didn't understand DOI and all that stuff, and you know, the links and stuff, but now I do. But I had to have someone help me figure it out, which was Nanny. Without that, I don't know, and it's kind of being cut off from another level of necessarily learning, but just another level. It requires so much effort.
I think that's one of the reasons that academia is seen as this like separate world, like, oh, you're an academic, because there are entry barriers to really understand what is going on in academia. And it's not just, oh, you're in a lab coat doing research. No, actually a lot of research is done at home staring at like multiple papers with like 50 tabs open.
Yeah, and I think I want to, like, that is something that I'd love to see, is making it more accessible, because there's so much amazing stuff, even in the small amount of research I've done this year. It's like, oh, it really helps me to understand why I work the way I do. It gives me context to understand more, and then there's the reflection piece, obviously, which is needed. Academia on its own is not enough, but it gives another point of context, another area of information, instead of just having to rely on the overly simplified, you know, YouTube videos that are out there on scientific stuff. It gives people the space to find it and make their own conclusions and learn more about different viewpoints and perspectives, instead of just sprouting the same old, you know, Feynman technique is amazing and not even for people on the audio, I now trigger him with that phrase.
He knows. He just knows. He knows it's annoying.
You know, it just, I think it's the same thing as you, but in a different context, moving the conversation on. It's like same with business, moving the conversation on, because it's there are a number of people who do a number of things, and you have to follow that way of working. And for me, I'm tired of it because it doesn't work that way. And for all of my clients that I've spoken to, for all of the people I speak to, it doesn't work. The things that are touted as the only way of working never bloody work.
For everyone.
For everyone. Yeah.
Look at it.
Yeah, thank you. Never work for everyone, and it's just moving it forward.
Yeah. Segue, learning hubs and online communities. I think we can use the conversations that we're having, whether that is with other academics, other people in the industry, or other people that are doing the work that we want to be doing, having conversations with those people I think needs to be easier, not necessarily easier to access those people, but easier to contribute to the conversation. And this is one of my bugbears in academia, is because of the words, the terms, the access, it's very, very difficult for what I call like lay people to contribute. And just because you're not doing academia, as in you're not at an institution or you're not doing formal research in a lab or wherever, doesn't mean you don't have something useful to say. Like that's completely not true. And in the coaching world, it's even more true, because sports coaches, like, okay, this is theory. How do you apply it to practice? They're going to be two different things. And I was reading a paper for the mocks yesterday, actually, and I was reading this paper and I was like, it's a great framework, and the people that have written it are all in the strength and conditioning field. They're all in the physical aspect of the field, and their framework is based quite heavily around physical development. But looking at it from a coach's perspective, I'm looking at thinking, nah, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, none of those are going to do any of those last 3 points. It's just not going to happen, because the social element of coaching, just no, not going to happen. But the majority of social coaches, the psychosocial elements of coaching, they are practicing. They are practicing coaches. They're not theoretical coaches. They're not people in academia. So those elements of the conversation aren't being brought forward as much as those people that are in sports science, just doing, hey, this is how you train, you run and jump and do this, that, and the other, locomotion, blah, blah, blah. Great. People. you're coaching people.
I think this is a thing with business coaching as well. There is a lack of people element, and also from the neurodiverse space, even in academia. Macadamia.
What accent is that? Where did that come from?
I don't know. Like
macadamia nuts, maybe?
Yeah, macadamias. You're all a bunch of macadamias. Oh dear.
Focus.
Thank you. Like,
oh dear, an hour and a half in, brain starts to melt.
Yeah, we normally have a break in between these. But yeah, like academia, oh whatever. I can't even cope now.
Academia. It's gone.
Neurodivergent. If you are neurodivergent or neurodiverse or whatever the word is that you want to use, it's even harder to figure stuff out. And having that understanding, like, has helped me researching the papers, finding the papers, learning how neurotypical brains, because most of the studies are done by neurotypical. They do not, unless you're searching for specific papers, which is a conversation you and I need to have afterwards, of like trying to find more diverse papers, which is very hard to find from what I understand. Depending on where you look, you can help me. It's like understanding how the normal brain works, and then understanding the differences for someone who is neurodivergent, because most of the advice out there is just perpetrated on this is that, this is how a normal brain works, because supposedly there are more normal people, which I really strongly disagree with, especially in the spaces that we inhabit. And I mean, my brain's melted. So we're just gonna.
I think to contribute to your conversation a little bit, I think what you were saying is like normal, abnormal, all of those conversations around bias, and certainly are elements of a wider conversation about research in general. And this is a conversation that, looking at the learning hubs and online communities where they can contribute, is that the neurodiverse element is popular, but because of the somewhat bias, p-hacking, all of the different elements of the publishing world. This is publishing, not academia. They're slightly different. Like the publishing of academia is challenging, but the publishing element of that world is somewhat biased. They want to see significant results. If you don't have a significant result, they are less likely to publish it, which means you're going to get loads of repeatability studies, which means the sample sizes are often going to be similar. And this is also partly due to most research being done in academic institutions, which means the sample size are students. In academia, which is a bias. It's a sample size that it's biased, it's grouped, and it's difficult to get other sample sizes unless you go into the public domain. But doing research in the public domain brings in loads of other barriers and issues, which is where online communities are useful. Even looking at YouTubers and influencers, Instagram people, like whoever, whatever, they just do a poll online. That is basically research. Yes, it's extremely biased because it's only individual.
I've caught myself up. That's exactly what the point I was trying to make is like bringing more conversations from neurodiverse. Like this is where an online community can help. Another reason why I joined Intellect. There we go. Because I liked the idea of like being the dumb one in the room, but being able to contribute to the conversation from a neurodiverse perspective, and to open the door for more people to talk about when the contexts don't match the science.
Interpretation
of the science. Thank you. When the context don't match the interpretations.
So it's with science, as with all communication from humans, there needs to be a level of interpretation. So like I was saying earlier about the study that was, read the mocks, but basically the study is a framework of each coaching session. You should do Rampage, I think it was. And it's strength and conditioning focused. And it is right. It's not wrong. It is right. It's completely true. But the interpretation of the study, when you consider other elements, other perspectives, other points of view, there are different perspectives that can be taken. There are different things that need to be considered. So Rampage, is it right? Yes, but how do you apply it? How do you actually put this into practice? Well, that requires interpretation. Where do you get those interpretations from? People that are either in the field or people that have a different perspective, which could be those individuals that are neurodivergent or have a different life experience. And that is where the conversations of online communities and comments on research, comments on discussions need to be had. That, like, I think this is me guessing, but I think some people are scared to comment on certain people's contributions to research because they feel like they have this status. They have a PhD, they know what they're talking about, or they are a doctor, they know what they're talking about. I use doctor because it's just this profession that people seem to go, oh yeah, they're really smart. They are, as a doctor. Just because they're a doctor doesn't mean they're smart at other things.
And from someone in that position, yes, that is why we don't. I can only talk for me. That is why I don't talk, because it's like, well, they have a PhD, they know more than me. I shouldn't have an opinion, which is obviously completely nonsense, and it's not true, because actually it helps to have more conversations. But it's about making it accessible for more conversations. I think that's what learning hubs and communities can do, and I can't give a good transition. Finding the right tools for you.
I mean, what I was going there. So my mindset when I was thinking that was psychological safety. That's the term in sports coaching, or psychology and sport. Psychological safety in the environment. So you feeling mentally safe in that environment. I think some tools do it well, other tools don't do it well. As an example, if you're in a Facebook group, it can be very easy to, depending on how big the Facebook group is, for your comment just to get lost and there be no response. Same within like big communities on Reddit, you can put a comment up or respond to something and your comment just get completely lost. Is that a psychologically safe environment? I would argue no, because you're putting a comment into this group of random people because you don't know who any of them are, and anyone can comment anywhere, anyway, anything, or they just leave it there. And if you don't get a response, most people will think, okay, was this a bad question? Or was it a silly question? Or was it wrong? Or and you're going to start questioning yourself by not getting a response. So that inaction actually causes a lot of mental strain for most people, because it's the way humans typically have been sort of like environmentally trained to think. Not ideal.
And from a personal thing, it takes a lot to make a comment in a big group. Like for me, the amount of capacity that it takes me, like the real cognitive, like, okay, what am I trying to say? How can I say it correctly? Like, do I say it in the right way? Make sure I frame every single context, because I understand how things are so up for interpretation. It takes a long time for me personally to reply. And so if there's no response to my reply or no response to another person's reply, it becomes very like, oh, have I said something wrong? Have I said something that wasn't correct? Have I broken a rule that I didn't even realize existed? Because I often have a tendency to do that. Now, obviously, there is a whole nother level of psychological, like, traumas and etc., that cannot be, you cannot do everything, but like just bringing the conversation forward of how hard it can be to make a comment.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, a bit of a segue here. Hacks, tips, and tricks. The tendency to lean towards the hacks, tips, and tricks in conversation, giving advice unsolicited, advice.
Your brain's melting now.
I just can't say some words. As you would have seen in my videos, some words I just can't say, and then like a couple of minutes later, I'm like, oh yeah, that's how I say that word. Yeah, my brain is like 3 or 4 words ahead. I'm like, yeah, letters, English. But the tips, tricks, and hacks, people like to give advice in communities, and the advice isn't always evidence-based. Now, evidence-based is a term that I came across in sports coaching, and it's having justification, rationalized justification for whatever it is that you believe. Now, I'm not going to go into what knowledge is. I think we did it a little bit.
Yes.
But essentially, knowledge is a justified true belief. 3 other words that, again, could be debated backwards and forwards, but an evidence-based tip, trick, or hack isn't really a tip, trick, or hack. It's just, this is what the evidence suggests.
And I think I mean, productivity hacks and tips, I think I was very anti-hack when I spoke about this, but my perspective is slightly shifting. I don't think it's the hacks that's the problem. It's the lack of context that's the problem. It's more the lack of context that's the issue when it comes to tips, tricks, and hacks. It's the fact that you don't necessarily understand the context behind what they are. And I think this leads on to one of our later conversations around like the 3 types of, note taking and the gardener, the librarian, etc. Like that is I am laughing for people on audio because Danny rolled his eyes so far back I think he nearly lost his eyeballs.
Yes, I'm not a fan of it.
But I think that there is I think it's a good framework. I genuinely believe it has value once you understand what it's really supposed to be doing. What we spoke about in that episode was around I think you have a different opinion judging by your facial review. I think it's a framework, it's a starting point. It's not an apt decision. It's a like, hey, do you like responding like this? This is 3 different ways you can do it, and there is a context. Like, find the context for the hack. Find the context for the framework, the tip, the trick that fits you. It's not a hard and fast rule that you have to follow. It's not a hard and fast rule that you have to have, projects in one folder, areas in another, resources in one, and archive in another, and then everything has a set position where they go. It's about adapting a framework. It's adaption or adoption and adaption. It's figuring out what the hacks are, what the context for you is, and then exploring that. And if it doesn't work, understanding that's fine. I think they have a place and they're useful as a prompt, but nothing more than a prompt, not a rule.
Yeah, I agree. I think so part of my reflection of this was what really is a hack, tip, and trick, because it's used so much. It's a marketing buzzword, but they all are marketing buzzwords. You see them in titles all over the place. And this actually relates to what I blogged about literally today, a guide. What is a guide? And I spoke about advice a little bit. And I think a lot of people give the quick takeaways, the short tips, tricks, or hacks, they don't necessarily give the evidence behind it, i.e. the contextual evidence. So how does this help? Where does this help? Why does this help this person in this context? And then what is all of the other evidence that supports or critiques this perspective, this piece of advice, this knowledge, whatever it is? So my reflection on this at the time was, what actually makes something a tip, trick, or hack? Because I was very confused as to how you could justify it being a tip, trick, or hack. Because essentially anything you say could be a tip. Literally anything you could say could be a tip. So how do you know whether a tip's going to be useful or not? You don't. It would need to be evidence-based. And if it's evidence-based, is it an evidence-based tip, or is it just good practice? Like, where's the difference? Is there a difference? And those were the questions that I was struggling with, because tips, tricks, and hacks are normally just this one-liner. And normally there are one-liner thing that you can do, but there are loads of one-liner things that you can do that aren't tips. They're just good practice. So yeah,
and I think that leads on quite nicely of like, productivity hacks, tips, and tricks are very much like the realm of entry for many content creators. It's like, I want to riff a little bit on that. Like, one of the concepts I had was like person-centered productivity. And when using that in an outside context, outside of the realm of people who understand what the person-centered approach is, etc., 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 it was like, I feel stupid. That phrase I know is marketing, and it makes me feel like that I don't understand it, so there's something wrong. And I think for me that was a huge reflection point of like, as a content creator, we have a responsibility to take, like, we have to promote ourselves and blah fucking blah and all of this kind of idea of marketing. But what happens when the marketing actually is damaging to the people you're trying to support? And that's been a big reflection for me on what I do, because it's easy to create marketing buzzwords and, hacks and tips and, buzzwords that have a real meaning. They mean something, but it is a shortened version of what they actually mean, when really you just say what it actually means instead, and people prefer it.
Yeah, in my reflections, the next three all connected. All connected. So the one about being a content creator, writing for reflection, and then digital gardening, they all connected because I was Obsidian Publish. I was writing for reflection because my Obsidian Publish, I was reflecting on all of my notes, and obviously Obsidian Publish is digital gardening. And as being a content creator, I was doing the digital gardening as part of my public reflection. So a lot of my reflections on those episodes congested. Okay, do I want to publish my notes? If I do want to publish my notes, how am I going to do it? Where am I going to do it? Why am I doing it? And am I sharing everything that I want, like everything that I'm reflecting? Not all of it. Like, what parts do I share? What parts don't I share? And that's like the creator element of that conversation. So I'm kind of like going to combine all three of them.
Yeah, let's do that. I like that.
Yeah. Also to help with time a little bit. Because it's like 20 to 12. Yeah. So what my consensus of all of this reflection is that I want to be as open and honest as possible with everyone. So these conversations that we're having, I am not holding anything back. Like, if I feel a way, I'm going to say it. We can cut it out afterwards, which is what we said at the beginning of the episode about the friction point. And can that cause uncomfortable feelings? Yes. Can it cause a little bit of like fear from sharing this thing? Yes. But I think, for me anyway, that fear is worth the benefit, because what I found, I say years ago, it's not even that long ago, it's like 4 years, my second year uni, is that I was so worried about what other people would think, and I was so worried about like doing the wrong thing, looking silly, the rest of it. I was still learning and doing the rest of it, but I was so worried about what other people would think and caring for other people that I forgot to care about like me.
Yeah.
It wasn't me that I was focused on. So I did things to help other people, even though it hurt me. And I still have that tendency. That is a personality trait of mine. It's a tendency of mine to help others before myself. But with the being a creator, sharing things and being completely open, I can help other people whilst helping myself, because everyone is going to give you feedback. Whether you like it or not, they will give you feedback. And the friction point, the pain that you can experience from my experience helps most of the time. Yes, it can hinder, but in the long term, normally it opens up conversations that you really need to have with yourself that you didn't think of having, because you've gone, nah, I'll leave that, and then you see a comment on a video or see something wherever and you go, actually maybe that is a thing. And a lot of the time that happens in these conversations, you'll say something, maybe it's not directed or intended in the way that I've perceived it, but I've gone, actually, you know what, maybe I need to think about that.
I think one of these episodes was, oh no, it was sharing your sources. That one was probably the one where you had a reflection, like a a larger reflection. It kind of like in the moment caught you quite well,
On camera, yeah. Like
on
I
camera
have a lot of
reflection.
those. I have a lot of those moments, like that moment there, like in the sources for sharing video episode, is what happens every time. Like every time I go through these reflections, like yeah, that's a good. But most of the time it happens after the episode, because I'm thinking, as I've just said, I'm thinking about the conversation at that time. Like my head is in the moment, what's going on, and my brain is, like I said earlier, my brain is just constantly going. So in that moment, I had the mental bandwidth, the brain space, the freedom to go, what? And that reflection was caught on camera, as it were.
I think there's also a point of that for me as well, because I realized, not on purposely, like there was a side that I wasn't showing with what I wrote, with what I said, with what I spoke about. And it was understanding, like being honest with myself as well. It's kind of going back to one of the earlier points I made about, like, I want to engage in more interesting conversations because I'm tired of feeling bored. Not because I don't like the people I hang around with and they don't watch it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But like, it shouldn't matter, yet it does. And so for me, one of the big reflections that I'm taking is like, one of the shifts I had, sorry, my brain just went, oh yeah, think about this point. Like one of the shifts I had is I am in a space with my own business coach who I look up to very much, and she's made a huge difference for my business and has been a real big prompting point to transition into what I really care about. And I was in that space, I was in her community, and I was asked to do workshops and run and show up as a leader in my own space. And one of the things was, she was like, "You're not ready to be a leader yet." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And that hit me quite hard. I was like, "What do you mean?" It's like, because you're too worried about what I think. And it was like, huh, that was a huge reflection point for me. It's like, I need to stop worrying about what people will think, because what I have to say makes a difference to people. And that was one of the bits that caught me, I think, from the difference between season one and season two, and even the more recent episodes, is being willing to say stuff that might, unintentionally upset someone, which I cannot actually control, no matter how much I want to.
Yeah.
And I think that was the interesting factor of, like, for me, as I go into the new year, as I'm reflecting, it's like being willing to say stuff that people won't like necessarily, and not caring about that. Although,
Yeah.
actually, no.
You're caring, you're just you're not letting it influence your
Yes,
actions.
that's it. That's better. Thank you. Yeah, it's like moving away from, like, okay, I'm just going to say, because as a coach, that is something that I've been doing more and more and more. Because at the end of the day, sometimes there are facts that are there, that cold hard things that are like, yes, is actually the truth, tough. And although we want to work in a place of joy all the time, which is where I started at the beginning of the year, like working with joy and etc., etc., sometimes you can't. And it's about figuring out how to find a way of dealing with that. So a reflection for me is like, for next year, if we can move on to
Yeah.
that, because I think we might need to because of the time.
Yeah, I was
But
looking.
like for me next year, my focus is less on trying to say the right things and just saying things, because I tried to craft not intentionally either. I was crafting a perspective and not sharing the things that I was struggling with. And it was interesting. I was in a session yesterday where people were talking about how they wish people would just share more about like what they're learning from. And I think this podcast kind of created some of that, but it also didn't at the same time, because we were still trying to promote something or think about something, or that might just be me.
Yeah.
But I'm
I was
quite
going to say, I think the first season you had an agenda in your mind.
Yeah,
Would that
whereas
be fair
this
to
season
say?
it's just like, this is I don't care. I'm like, I'm just gonna talk, we're gonna have conversations, and it's fascinating, and we don't have to worry about what's gonna be said when and where, and we just get it out. And I think that's gonna continue, and it's gonna kind of come out into all of my content. All of the things that I'm creating this year is gonna be less about trying to please the algorithm and the people around it, and more around saying what I want to say and then promoting the crap out of it to give an alternative perspective instead of hiding the alternative perspective, which is what I subconsciously was doing because I didn't want to upset people. So
I think I'm going to talk about what I'm doing next year in a second, but there was a conversation that I was listening to yesterday. One of the many podcasts that I listened to. It wasn't actually, it was a podcast, but I listened to it on YouTube because I prefer watching the conversation if I can. So I was listening to this conversation, which again, it's not my field of research. It's not my area of research, but I want to feel dumb. I want to learn different contexts. And I was listening to teachers talk about the curriculum. UK teachers talking about the curriculum of UK schools, and they were having this conversation. There were four of them having this conversation, and they said something that I was like, yes. And they were saying that there was a webinar conversation about the curriculum, and they didn't realize that teachers cared so much about the curriculum. Like, they enjoy thinking about how to think through doing a lesson. They love having those conversations, and so do I. Like, why are you putting that image there? Why are you doing this before that? Why are you teaching them this in this way? Why are you using those words? People love having those conversations, but they're not open conversations in a lot of forums. So they were sort of saying, oh, we need to have more of these conversations, etc., etc. And I was like, yes, agreed. And this is where some of the work that I'm doing next year, 2022, I plan to do next year, is moving those conversations on. So I alluded to it earlier that my YouTube channel is going to be tied in with my future PhD. When I'm going to officially start it, I'm not sure. You'll probably see on the channel. But my PhD is in education, essentially coach education, and how understanding impacts learning behaviors. And my YouTube channel is going to be focused on moving conversations forwards in learning, not necessarily study techniques, even though study techniques are elements of learning, but all of the elements around cognitive psychology. Then when it comes to the podcast, it would be essentially going through the podcast conversations that I listen to and reflecting on them. So the podcast would be a reflection on other contributions to the conversation. So it's all related. And then the MOOCs, which is going to be a monthly observation of coaching science, which is essentially me going through the research that I'm looking at, which will be recent research, and bringing in my own interpretations of the information. Yes, I could do it as a blog, but I think doing it as a review that I can share as a PDF will, one, be more useful for people in institutions that want to just share it because it's a PDF, and it's, for whatever reason, academics love to share PDFs everywhere. So there's that, but it also brings an element of formatting organization to it. Rather than it being this blog post that I'll just share on the internet, there is a format. What's the purpose of the study? What's the methods? What are the findings? What's the interpretation? And people can go and explore. So it's a science digest, as well as bringing in personal interpretations into the work. And what I think, what the idea is to therefore have a short level of conversation, coaching science conversation, a broader level of conversation, a reflection level, and then like keeping up to date with the research. So that's plans for 2022, plus obviously the PhD whenever that happens. What about you?
Yeah, so my plans for 2022 is going to be bringing in a lot of my work is time for time, and I want to move away from that, and have more autonomy, which is a lovely word, which everybody uses, but just being able to, in my head, understand that I accept the autonomy as well. It's like I don't have to be working all of the time, and actually reshifting my focus away from trying to do everything to doing the things that actually are important to me, which is having more conversations with more people, pushing myself to do that, because I do struggle with having conversations. I'm just comfortable talking to you and the people that I know, but I want to have more conversations with more people and actually do that. And then obviously there is the book. I want to be writing a book around building a business that is based around you, that is making, allowing you to go past and finding the context and discovering the context, and it's still very much in the air and thinking about it. So this is just train of thought of like being able to move beyond just the hacks and tips and tricks and actually using them in a way that fits you, instead of just following the advice blindly, knowing that you're not broken, and understanding that actually there isn't a problem with you, and also navigating the business world in a different way so that you create something that fits for you, because that's the only way that I believe a business can work, is if it fits you, if it works for you. And then when things don't work, you have a toolkit of options, not do this or do this, but a toolkit of like, hey, here in psychology is this concept, here and this is this concept. Here's how I've used that. Here's how this person, and engaging in more people, in more conversations with all types of people to figure out, hey, this is how this person has used this technique in a way that works for them, instead of just going, yeah, this is how you do it, because nobody talks about that. And I want to be part of that conversation and bring that in. That
Sounds
was
good.
cool. I need to clip that like little bit at the end. Can you clip that
Oh,
and send that to me?
I'm going to send you the whole thing.
I know I'm being lazy. No, efficient. You can clip that for me, slave. You want more control.
No, quite the opposite. If you could do everything, great. But I mean, it doesn't take me much time. So,
No, I will get that bit because that was.
but yeah, well,
That's
I thought
fun.
you were going to listen back to it anyway and like reflect. But
Nah, fuck that. Yeah, no, I probably will actually. That is something that I want to
I was
do.
going to say this will be one of those episodes that would be worth, like, really worth having a look back and going, where was my mind at? So yeah, right. This is the last one of 2021. So for everyone listening, have a good Christmas and New Year. Quick disclaimer, I'm having surgery on the 5th of January on my eye. So we're going to have to work out what's happening with the podcast when it's starting, like now. So
Cool. Bye, guys.
bye, everyone.